your sleeve, and if you recall, there is a marking that I had you transfer on the sleeve that we now want to go in and cut. So grab my mark, go in and cut it right to the end, and this will become the vent for the sleeve. All right. And what we're doing with the bias is we are creating this little placket. All right. So it just clean finishes the edge of the opening. Okay. So what you want to do is you want to take the bias. There's a reason why I'm standing. So I have to go. You want to take the bias. We're going to take that slit that we just clipped. And we're going to spread it open like that. Right, just spread it open so that it's a straight line. Not like that. We want it as a straight line. And I'm going to take my bias and line up the raw edge of the bias to. And this, you're putting the bias on the back side of the fabric. So you're pinning raw edge bias, and you're spreading that slash open, and you're lining the raw edge with the slash open. Now, because I'm having you sort of pull this and force it into a straight line, what happens is when I go to pin bias edge to edge, you can see that the center drops down a little bit. The point where I clipped drops down, and there's no way that you can have that meet the raw edge because you've got all this cluster of fabric right there that interferes with it. Just allow it to fall where it's falling, but then once you start pinning again, get the other side up to the raw edge. Find that the bias strip is a little long. It's fine. Once you have it in place, just trim off whatever excess you have. And so it should look essentially like that. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to stitch a little, slightly under 1/4 of an inch. We're going to stitch along that raw edge. Let me show you one more. Raw edge to raw edge, the bias is the thing that's underneath, and raw edge is lining up, but then we get to that point where the slash mark forms this little drape or this little flare in that section of the fabric, and it all clumps and clusters up together. But what we're going to do is we're pinning it, and we are stitching a little under 1/4 of an inch straight along, and when we get to this point, we're not going to try to force this edge up to the top. We're leaving it so that it dips down from the edge. And we're stitching so that it just barely catches the edge here. But you want to be careful because what you don't want to do is you don't want to stitch down. And in the course of stitching down, you're catching that excess flare of fabric. And then you're going to create a pleat or a little tuck. And you don't want that. You want that to be a clean finish. If you look at this, it's a clean finish. There's no tuck at that clip point, all right? And that's the reason why, because you're stitching just under that dipped edge, and then continue down the other way. All of this, see how the fabric is sort of clumping together in the middle at that pivot point, at that point that I clipped? Just make sure that when you get to that point, it's laying, just manipulate the fabric so that it's laying as flat as possible. Can you all see that? Stand up and take a look at how I'm holding the fabric so that when I go to stitch it, I'm going to stitch and then I'm just barely going to catch that edge and then continue my stitching. Oh. And now see, this is where you need to go slow because you want to just, in fact, at this point, if you want to walk the machine, and then continue straight stitching on the other end.
So you should be able to like find out within the quarter of an inch, almost to the quarter, right? Or you actually dip down slightly to make that.
You really should try to keep it straight. It's fairly straight.
Are you knotting those threads after?
No,
No.
not doing anything. Just clipping. Because that's all going to get caught into the cuff. All right, so once that's done, check the other side. Make sure you haven't created a pleat or a tuck. I'm fine. I'm good to go. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to take that seam allowance that I just created and I want to press it up towards the bias. You can do this on the ironing board. I'm just finger pressing it now to make it easier. Again, you're pressing your seam allowance that you just created up towards the bias. Okay? Once you've done that, you turn it back around, and again, you're always clipping if there's any rough edges, clip them. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the folded edge of my bias and I'm going to wrap it around what I just stitched. And the folded edge I'm lining up with my stitch line. You can all see that? So I'm wrapping, I'm basically encasing the stitch that I just created. I am going to put this in the machine and stitch right along that edge. So I'm folding it over that stitch, and then I'm going to stitch right on top of it, do a top stitch right on the edge.
Are you stitching the same line the seam is already, or are you putting a new line?
Folding it until it, you actually want it to just ever so slightly go over the stitch line. And when you get to this cluster of fabric, again, make sure that it's all laying flat, that you're not